In the spring of 1943, a battle-hardened veteran of the Africa Corps stepped off a train into the sweltering American Midwest. Conditioned by Joseph Goebbels' propaganda machine, he braced himself for the brutal torture and starvation promised to captured soldiers. Instead, exhausted and bewildered, he was handed a glass bottle of ice-cold Coca-Cola and a scoop of vanilla ice cream. By all conventional logic of total war, providing luxury consumer goods to sworn enemies made absolutely no sense. Yet this bizarre welcome wasn't an accident. It was the opening move in a massive, highly calculated logistical operation that would quietly rewrite the rules of captivity. Between 1943 and 1945, the United States interned nearly 400,000 German prisoners of war across a sprawling network of domestic camps. This was not merely a secure holding action designed to keep enemy combatants off the battlefield. It evolved into a deliberate, quiet campaign where the American military weaponized basic consumer logistics, from the stocked shelves of camp canteens to the standardized wages earned in local agricultural fields, to steadily dismantle the psychological foundations of the Third Reich. Yet this approach presented a profound contradiction that sparked fierce debate. The core question emerged: could a system built on 10-cent canteen coupons, a massive surplus of daily calories, and exposure to American consumerism actually break the ingrained fanaticism of heavily indoctrinated soldiers? Or was the War Department simply providing a comfortable, state-sponsored sanctuary for unrepentant fascists while American troops bled and died overseas? The stakes were incredibly high, and the experiment was fraught with intense internal camp violence, as die-hard loyalists ruthlessly enforced ideological discipline against anyone who seemed softened by their new reality. To understand how this unprecedented form of psychological warfare actually functioned on the ground, we first have to examine the sheer scale of the initial problem. We must look at the massive, overwhelming logistical nightmare Washington suddenly faced when these enemy combatants, captured first in North Africa and later across Europe, began arriving at East Coast ports by the tens of thousands, demanding an immediate, functional containment infrastructure that simply did not exist. Starting in May 1943, following the sudden Axis collapse in Tunisia, the logistical tide of the Atlantic violently reversed. Liberty ships, originally designed to haul American armor and ammunition eastward to the front lines, were returning to ports like New York and Norfolk, packed with human cargo. Over 150,000 German and Italian troops had surrendered in North Africa, and the British military, lacking both the food reserves and the geographic space to hold them, practically begged the United States to take the bulk of the prisoners. The Provost Marshal General's Office, operating under Major General Alan W. Gullion, suddenly faced an administrative catastrophe. In the span of just a few frantic weeks, the War Department had to construct a massive carceral archipelago across the North American continent for an army that had just been shooting at Allied forces. Washington's response to this influx was not driven by humanitarian warmth, but by a ruthless defensive legalism. The blueprint for this sudden domestic prison system was the 1929 Geneva Convention relative to the treatment of prisoners of war. Both the United States and Germany were signatories, and the War Department intended to follow the treaty to the absolute letter. Article 11 of the convention was unambiguous. The food ration of prisoners of war must be equal in quantity and quality to that of troops at base camps, and their quarters must mirror those provided to the detaining power's own forces. The military leadership, heavily influenced by Army Chief of Staff George C. Marshall, viewed strict compliance as a strategic imperative, a form of diplomatic armor. As American casualties mounted and thousands of GIs fell into German hands in Europe, the War Department operated on a doctrine of reciprocal leverage. By meticulously documenting their flawless treatment of the Afrika Korps in places like Texas and Kansas, Washington believed it could legally and morally pressure Berlin into maintaining minimum survival standards for American boys locked in stalags across the Third Reich. This strict legal adherence translated into a staggering logistical reality on the ground. The Army Corps of Engineers rapidly converted old civilian conservation corps camps, unused county fairgrounds, and newly poured concrete foundations into standardized military enclosures. Each camp was built to exact military specifications, perfectly mirroring the barracks of American infantrymen in basic training. But the most jarring execution of the Geneva Convention was the dietary mandate. The military quartermaster system, humming with unprecedented industrial efficiency, pumped vast quantities of prime resources into the prison enclosures. German soldiers, many of whom had survived on meager, sand-crusted rations during the final days of the Desert Campaign, suddenly found themselves seated in clean mess halls, consuming up to 3,400 calories a day. The daily manifest included fresh beef, pork, eggs, milk, white bread, and seasonal vegetables, delivered with the same relentless punctuality that supplied U.S. training bases. This rigid adherence to international law immediately and violently collided with the reality of the American home front. By late 1943, the American public was enduring the heaviest civilian restrictions of the war. The Office of Price Administration had instituted strict rationing for everyday citizens. Red stamps dictated the purchase of meat and butter. Blue stamps controlled canned goods. Sugar and coffee were tightly guarded commodities. Yet, in towns across the Midwest and the Deep South, local residents watched military supply trucks loaded with premium cuts of meat and fresh dairy rolling directly through the gates of barbed wire compounds. Rumors and confirmed reports alike began to circulate, sparking intense political outrage. Newspaper editorials fumed about the deliberate coddling of the enemy. Congressional representatives received furious letters from the mothers and wives of deployed soldiers, demanding to know why arrogant, unrepentant fascists were eating roasted turkey and fresh butter, while American civilians scraped together rationed, meatless meals and planted victory gardens to survive. The friction was palpable, creating a severe public relations nightmare for the Roosevelt administration, which had to constantly defend the policy as a necessary, cold-blooded tactic to protect captured Americans overseas. But as the domestic political pressure mounted over the food supply, a second, arguably more critical crisis emerged on the home front, one that would force the War Department to radically alter its approach to the internment system. The mobilization of over 16 million American men and women into the armed forces and defense industries had completely drained the domestic agricultural workforce. By the harvest season of 1943, the farming sector was facing an existential threat. Across the Mississippi Delta, cotton remained unpicked. In the Midwest, millions of bushels of corn and wheat were at severe risk of rotting in the fields. Northern logging camps were paralyzed by a lack of lumberjacks, threatening the supply of wood and paper vital to the war effort. The War Manpower Commission issued a dire warning of catastrophic shortfalls in food and raw materials if manual labor was not immediately secured. The solution lay sitting idly behind barbed wire, eating government-issued beef. Under Article 27 of the Geneva Convention, a detaining power had the explicit legal right to utilize the labor of healthy, enlisted prisoners of war, provided the work had no direct connection to the operations of the war. They could not build bombers or manufacture artillery shells, but they could absolutely dig irrigation ditches, pick tomatoes, and cut timber. The War Department, desperate to stabilize the agricultural economy, initiated a massive deployment of the POW population. Prisoners were shipped from central holding facilities into hundreds of smaller, temporary branch camps erected near critical agricultural and industrial hubs across the country. However, under international law, this forced deployment could not be treated as slave labor. Article 34 of the convention mandated that prisoners must be financially compensated for their work. The War Department established a standardized wage of 80 cents per day for agricultural and contract labor. The economics of this program were highly advantageous for the federal government. Local farmers and corporations contracted the labor through the military, paying the U.S. Treasury the prevailing local civilian wage, often around $2 to $3 a day, to prevent the artificial undercutting of American workers. The military then paid the German prisoner his mandated 80 cents, keeping the substantial difference to offset the immense operational costs of running the internment program. Yet, handing hard American cash directly to hundreds of thousands of enemy combatants was an unacceptable security risk, providing instant resources for escape attempts, bribery, and civilian sabotage. To solve this, the military implemented a closed-loop economic system. The prisoners were paid exclusively in highly specific, proprietary currency, camp script, usually issued in small booklets of paper coupons in denominations of 1, 5, and 10 cents. This solved the immediate security problem, but created a new logistical hurdle. Earning 80 cents a day in worthless paper would quickly sap any motivation to work, leading to malingering, slowdowns, and unrest in the fields. For the agricultural labor program to actually function, the military had to guarantee that the paper coupons possessed tangible, immediate value. The War Department had to provide a place for the prisoners to spend their earnings. This strict logistical necessity, born entirely from the collision of international legal obligations, severe domestic labor shortages, and basic security protocols, led to the standardized construction of the camp canteen. It was intended simply as an administrative endpoint, a highly controlled mechanism to keep the agricultural workforce motivated and compliant. But the moment these battle-hardened soldiers stepped out of the harsh sun, walked up to a wooden counter, and handed over their first newly earned 10-cent coupon, the War Department unknowingly triggered a profound psychological shockwave. For the average German soldier, entering an American camp canteen in late 1943 was a profoundly disorienting experience. They were walking into an environment designed purely for routine military logistics, yet the visual impact was staggering. Behind the wooden counters, shelves were stacked high with cartons of Lucky Strike and Camel cigarettes, an array of Hershey chocolate bars, cold bottles of Coca-Cola, various flavors of ice cream, fresh citrus fruits, chewing gum, and daily hygiene products. There were no empty spaces, no ration lines, and no frantic shortages. This immediate, tangible abundance triggered a massive cognitive dissonance. For years, the Nazi propaganda apparatus had meticulously drilled a specific narrative into the minds of its military and civilian population. The United States was a decadent, fractured, and collapsing society. The German state controlled the media, continuously broadcasting that American capitalism was a chaotic failure, incapable of sustaining a serious, protracted global war. The prisoners had been told that the American home front was starving, paralyzed by strikes, and structurally weak. Yet here they stood, captured enemies in a foreign land, holding paper coupons earned from picking cotton or cutting timber, and using them to casually purchase luxury consumer goods that were nearly impossible to find even for high-ranking officers back in the Reich. The psychological shock was immediate. It wasn't just the fact that the goods were available. It was the sheer, unbothered scale of it all. The canteens were restocked with mechanical regularity. If a prisoner bought 3 chocolate bars on Tuesday, the shelf was full again by Wednesday. This relentless logistical consistency demonstrated an industrial capacity that defied everything they had been taught. The initial reaction among many prisoners was deep suspicion. Some believed the fully stocked shelves were a temporary illusion, a staged propaganda trick designed to break their morale before the real starvation began. Others hoarded their purchases, expecting the supply lines to suddenly dry up. But as weeks turned into months, the supply trucks kept arriving. The ice cream remained cold. The cigarettes remained cheap. The realization slowly began to set in, not through political arguments or interrogations, but through the mundane act of buying a soda. If the United States could afford to lavish this level of excess consumer production on its captured enemies, while simultaneously fighting massive multi-front wars in both the Pacific and European theaters, the strategic math of the conflict began to look terrifyingly insurmountable. The sheer volume of resources required to maintain these camps quietly communicated a brutal truth. Germany was fighting an industrial behemoth that operated on an entirely different scale. This logistical reality planted the first insidious seeds of doubt regarding Germany's ability to win a global war of attrition. The pristine shelves of the camp stores eroded the absolute certainty of the Nazi narrative faster than any leaflet dropped over the battlefield. However, the American administration's unintentional psychological victory in the canteens was about to trigger a violent, organized backlash. The ideological battle inside the wire was only just beginning. The psychological breach created by a 10-cent bottle of Coca-Cola was immediate, but the War Department's consumer-driven pacification did not operate in a vacuum. The canteens were merely the endpoint of a much larger daily logistical cycle that forcibly exposed the German prisoners to the staggering scale of the American home front. Every morning, as the sun rose over the vast expanses of the United States, hundreds of thousands of POWs were loaded onto open-bed military trucks and transported out of their barbed wire enclosures into the humming, relentless engine of the American agricultural and industrial sectors. In the sprawling cotton fields of Texas, the dense logging camps of Maine, the sprawling peanut farms of Georgia, and the vast fruit orchards of California, the prisoners did not just perform manual labor, they became first-hand witnesses to an economic reality that completely contradicted everything they had been taught by the Ministry of Public Enlightenment and Propaganda. They watched American farmers operate massive gasoline-powered tractors and mechanical harvesters, heavy machinery that, back in Germany, would have been immediately requisitioned for the war effort, melted down for armor plating, or stripped for vital spare parts. They saw rural highways choked with civilian automobiles, heavy freight trains stretching to the horizon, hauling endless lines of boxcars, and local grain silos overflowing with unprecedented, record-breaking harvests. Most importantly, they noticed that the fuel required to run this immense domestic machine flowed without a single interruption. This was a stark, undeniable contrast to the crippling petroleum shortages that were actively paralyzing the Wehrmacht across the European theater, grounding the Luftwaffe and halting panzer divisions in their tracks. The prisoners were earning their 80 cents a day in small booklets of paper camp scrip, but on a much deeper psychological level, they were physically interacting with an economy completely unbothered by a two-front global war. When a German soldier worked a 10-hour shift in an American cannery or a Midwestern lumber yard, he wasn't just passing the time. He was experiencing the sheer, unadulterated output of a nation that was outproducing the combined Axis powers by margins that defied human comprehension. For the average enlisted conscript, this daily, repetitive exposure was a slow, ideological poison. The fierce fanaticism instilled by years in the Hitler Youth and the relentless daily drumbeat of the Nazi state apparatus began to fundamentally fracture under the crushing weight of empirical evidence. A prisoner could stubbornly argue politics in the darkness of the barracks, but he could not argue with a sky darkened by formations of brand new four-engine bombers rolling off assembly lines just a few miles from his work detail. He could not debate the tonnage of an American train yard moving more logistical supplies in a single week than his entire infantry division had seen in a year of heavy combat. The quiet, unspoken acceptance of American industrial supremacy began to spread organically through the prisoner population. Men who had fought ferociously in the blinding dust of Kasserine Pass or the freezing mountains of Italy were now carefully folding their paper scrip, saving up for premium tobacco, comparing the high quality of American leather boots to their own, and actively debating the merits of modern, mechanized farming techniques. But this ideological erosion did not go unnoticed. Inside the densely packed 80-man barracks, a lethal, invisible war was brewing, fought entirely outside the view of the American guards. The prisoner population was not a uniform monolith of defeated men. Scattered among the pragmatic conscripts, the older reservists, and the war-weary veterans was a hard core of fiercely committed, uncompromising National Socialists. These were the die-hard loyalists, former SS members, hardened paratroopers, U-boat crews, and elite Africa Corps officers who still viewed themselves as active combatants operating behind enemy lines. For these men, the sight of their fellow soldiers casually drinking American soda, purchasing American magazines, and willingly cooperating with the camp administration was not just a minor breach of military discipline, it was a catastrophic failure of morale and an act of high treason against the Reich. Realizing they were rapidly losing ideological control over the enlisted men to the soft, creeping power of American consumerism, the hardliners moved ruthlessly to reestablish the terror apparatus of the Nazi state right in the heart of the American Midwest. They formed clandestine networks, heavily organized and fiercely enforced, often referring to themselves as the Lager Gestapo, the Camp Gestapo. Because the American military adhered strictly to the 1929 Geneva Convention, which legally allowed captured officers and non-commissioned officers to maintain internal discipline and command structures over their own men, these radical factions were initially left largely to their own devices. The U.S. camp commanders, many of whom were older, were called veterans of the First World War, or logistical administrators with absolutely zero counterintelligence training, fundamentally misunderstood the deadly dynamics at play. When they saw the barking of German orders, the rigid marching formations, and the spotless, perfectly squared barracks, they assumed these were simply the signs of a well-ordered, cooperative military encampment. They were completely blind to the shadow courts operating after lights out. The enforcement of Nazi ideology within the camps was systemic, highly organized, and terrifyingly violent. The hardliners established secret intelligence networks within the compounds, meticulously monitoring the behavior of every single inmate. They noted who spent too much time talking to American guards, who bought English language dictionaries in the canteen, who lingered to listen to American radio broadcasts, and who expressed even the mildest pessimism about Germany's rapidly deteriorating military prospects. If a prisoner was deemed a defeatist, a sympathizer, or a traitor, he was subjected to a brutal, escalating campaign of intimidation. It almost always began with psychological terror. The victim would be subjected to a suffocating, silent treatment by his entire barracks, orchestrated by the block leaders. His personal rations, his letters from home, and his hard-earned canteen purchases would be stolen or destroyed. Chillingly, the hardliners would whisper that his family, back in the Reich, would be immediately reported to the SS and sent to a concentration camp, a threat that carried immense psychological weight, as the prisoners knew the Gestapo closely monitored the families of captured soldiers to ensure their continued loyalty. When psychological pressure failed to bring a dissenting prisoner back in line, the violence escalated rapidly and mercilessly. The shadow courts held midnight tribunals in the washrooms or the darkest, unlit corners of the barracks. These kangaroo courts were modeled on the notorious People's Court in Berlin. Sentences were passed in the dark, entirely without defense or appeal. Prisoners who crossed the Loyalists were severely beaten with heavy wooden tent poles, struck with rocks stuffed into thick wool socks, or brutally shoved into deep, overflowing latrines. In the most extreme cases, the tribunals handed down death sentences. Men were found hanging from the rafters of the washrooms, their deaths carefully staged by the executioners to look like standard suicides brought on by the depression of captivity. Others were beaten to death in their bunks, while dozens of other prisoners, completely paralyzed by the sheer terror of the enforcers, pretended to sleep through the muffled screams, the shattering of bones, and the desperate pleas for mercy. The most infamous incidents exposed the lethal, uncompromising grip the radicals held over the population. The brutal murder of Johannes Koons at Camp Tonkawa in Oklahoma, who was beaten to death by a frenzied mob of his fellow inmates simply for handing a diary containing anti-Nazi thoughts to an American officer, or the calculated, cold-blooded lynching of U-boat crewman Werner Drexler at Camp Papago Park in Arizona, demonstrated that the war was still actively raging inside the wire. For the average German soldier simply trying to survive the war, the casual comfort of the camp canteen was utterly meaningless if spending your newly earned scrip meant waking up with a fractured skull or a tightened noose around your neck. For months, the American administrative response to this internal bloodshed was disastrously slow and dangerously naive. The War Department was entirely focused on the massive logistics of housing, feeding, and deploying hundreds of thousands of men, not the intricate, deadly nuances of psychological warfare, factionalism, and ideological subversion. Camp commanders routinely filed the hanging deaths as standard suicides, and the severe beatings as typical, expected barracks brawls among restless men. They were either unwilling or completely unable to penetrate the absolute wall of silence maintained by the terrified prisoner population, who knew that speaking to the Americans was an automatic death sentence. But as the body count steadily rose, and the internal violence began to severely disrupt the agricultural labor quotas that the fragile American civilian economy desperately relied upon, Washington was finally forced to acknowledge the invisible war. The Provost Marshal General's Office, working in close conjunction with the Military Intelligence Division, realized that treating all German prisoners as a single, uniform entity was a fatal security flaw that was costing lives and hampering the war effort on the home front. They needed to dismantle the shadow courts, and they needed to do it legally, without violating the strict mandates of international law, which forbade collective punishment. The solution was a massive, highly covert intelligence operation aimed at total ideological segregation. The military intelligence apparatus slowly began infiltrating the camp hierarchies. They started planting informants within the compounds, courageous anti-Nazi prisoners who were willing to risk their lives to secretly identify the hardliners, map the command structures, and document the mechanisms of the kangaroo courts. Intelligence officers began secretly intercepting, translating, and analyzing the massive volume of outgoing prisoner mail, scrutinizing letters for coded messages, political fanaticism, and unwavering allegiance to the Nazi Party. They meticulously checked SS blood-type tattoos, cross-referenced individual unit histories, and tracked the internal movement of suspected enforcers. Based on this vast, covert data gathering, the administration meticulously built psychological dossiers on the internal hierarchy of every major camp in the country. The military categorized the prisoners into three distinct ideological groups. The whites were those who were actively anti-Nazi, pro-democratic, or deeply cooperative with the Americans. The grays constituted the vast majority of ordinary, apolitical soldiers whose primary allegiance was simply to survival, earning their canteen scrip, and eventually returning home in one piece. The blacks were the fanatical enforcers of the Nazi regime, the dedicated loyalists driving the violence, the intimidation, and the shadow courts. Once the intelligence net was firmly cast and the high-value targets were explicitly identified, the American military executed a series of sudden, highly coordinated tactical raids. In the dead of night, heavily armed American guards, accompanied by intelligence officers holding specific, carefully vetted lists of names, would suddenly enter the barracks. The radical officers, the ringleaders of the shadow courts, and the primary physical enforcers were abruptly pulled from their beds, given absolutely no time to pack their belongings, destroy documents, or communicate with their subordinates. They were loaded onto heavily guarded, blacked-out trains and permanently removed from the general population. They were transferred to specialized, high-security segregation facilities designed exclusively for the most dangerous, unrepentant ideological extremists. The most prominent of these was Camp Alva in Oklahoma, a desolate, heavily fortified compound that was quickly dubbed the Devil's Island of the American POW system. At Alva and other similar maximum security camps, the hardliners were entirely stripped of their influence over the pragmatic majority, isolated in the harsh, unforgiving plains, and placed under intense, unyielding guard where their ideological fanaticism could do no further harm to the labor force. The head of the snake had been decisively, surgically severed. The permanent removal of the radical factions fundamentally and instantly altered the atmosphere within the standard branch camps across the country. The suffocating blanket of midnight terror was instantly lifted. The gray majority, no longer fearing for their lives or the safety of their families in Germany, breathed a collective, massive sigh of relief. The barracks transformed from arenas of suspicion and violence into places of actual rest. And it was exactly in this newly pacified, highly secure environment that the War Department confidently launched the next critical phase of its campaign, a highly classified, carefully calibrated program of soft re-education. Officially titled the Intellectual Diversion Program, this ambitious initiative was kept completely hidden from the American public and the German government alike. Under the strict rules of the Geneva Convention, forced political indoctrination or brainwashing of prisoners of war was a direct violation of international law. The chief architect of the program, Major Edward Davison, clearly understood that forcing combat-hardened German soldiers into classrooms and lecturing them about the virtues of Jeffersonian democracy would be instantly dismissed as crude, heavy-handed propaganda. Instead, the American strategy was remarkably subtle and devastatingly effective. Let the facts do the heavy lifting. The military would simply provide the intellectual tools, the physical space, and the unfiltered information, and let the prisoners deconstruct their own heavily indoctrinated worldview at their own individual pace. With the violent enforcers permanently removed from the equation, the camp administrations began quietly introducing curated information into the daily lives of the prisoners. They stocked the newly built camp libraries with thousands of books that had been famously banned and burned by the Nazi regime during the cultural purges of the 1930s. Works by Thomas Mann, Erich Maria Remarque, Franz Kafka, and Heinrich Heine were placed openly on the shelves, completely accessible to anyone holding a camp library card. They allowed the daily circulation of major American newspapers like the New York Times and the Washington Post, giving the prisoners a completely different, uncensored perspective on the global conflict and the realities of free press reporting. To further penetrate the psychological barrier, the military established a national German-language POW newspaper called Der Ruf, or The Call. Written and edited entirely by carefully vetted, highly educated anti-Nazi prisoners held at a special classified camp in Rhode Island, Der Ruf was printed and distributed across the entire continental camp network. It provided legitimate, uncensored news about the war's progression, wrapped seamlessly in familiar cultural formats, German poetry, and dense intellectual essays that deeply appealed to the German reader, subtly guiding them away from totalitarian thought and toward democratic ideals. But without question, the most devastatingly effective weapon in the soft re-education arsenal was the simple movie projector. Twice a week, the the expansive wooden camp mess halls were converted into makeshift theaters. The administration screened popular Hollywood entertainment films, musicals, and comedies to boost general morale and showcase American culture. But the main feature presentation was always preceded by mandatory, unedited newsreels. For years, the German soldiers had only ever seen Joseph Goebbels' meticulously crafted Wochenschau, the weekly propaganda films that portrayed endless, glorious German victories, invincible armor, and an unyielding, unified home front that could withstand any assault. Now, sitting in the dark in rural Kansas, Alabama, and Texas, surrounded by their fellow prisoners, they watched raw, unedited, high-resolution combat footage of the overwhelming Allied war machine in action. They watched the massive 1,000-bomber daylight raids systematically leveling German industrial centers, rail yards, and cities. They saw the sheer, overwhelming volume of American Liberty ships crossing the Atlantic, unloading literal mountains of materiel, tanks, and artillery onto the beaches of Europe. And they watched the relentless, grinding, unstoppable advance of the Red Army in the East, slowly and brutally pushing the fractured Wehrmacht back toward the very borders of the Reich. Crucially, because these newsreels were presented alongside the tangible, everyday reality of their lives, the overflowing shelves of the canteens, the massive agricultural production they witness in the fields, the uninterrupted, endless supply lines feeding their own camps, the cinematic footage possessed an undeniable, crushing authenticity. The prisoners could not dismiss the screen as cheap enemy propaganda because they were physically living inside the very industrial machine that was systematically destroying their country. The truth was not forced upon them. It simply surrounded them day and night until it could no longer be rationally denied. By late 1944 and early 1945, the changing mindset within the camps was profound, measurable, and highly visible to the American administrators. The carefully engineered combination of secure, violence-free barracks, steady labor wages, the undeniable comfort of the camp stores, and the quiet, steady infusion of accurate, uncensored information had effectively neutralized the fighting spirit of the captive army. The average prisoner, who only a year earlier might have been willing to die a martyr for the Fuhrer, was now spending his evenings taking university-level correspondence courses, diligently studying English grammar, and carefully saving his 10-cent scrip for a better brand of shaving cream or a new fountain pen from the canteen. They were actively participating in democratic camp elections to choose their own spokesmen and labor representatives. They were organizing jazz bands, theater troupes, and philosophical debating societies. Most importantly, they had quietly, collectively accepted the absolute inevitability of total, unconditional defeat long before the first Allied tanks crossed the Rhine River into the heart of Germany. The American strategy of consumer-driven pacification, fiercely protected by ruthless intelligent segregation and nourished by the sheer, overwhelming abundance of the home front, had decisively triumphed over ingrained ideological fanaticism. The system was working perfectly. The invisible, lethal war fought inside the wire had been won by the quiet, overwhelming logistics of democracy. But as the winter snows thawed into the fateful spring of 1945, the carefully controlled, secure bubble of the American camp system was about to burst. The casual comfort of ice cream, canteen coupons, and quiet re-education would soon brutally collide with an undeniable, horrifying reality that no amount of psychological conditioning could prepare them for. In April 1945, the meticulously curated reality inside the American internment camps violently shattered. The information flowing through the camp libraries and the daily deliveries of major newspapers was no longer just about retreating front lines, strategic bombing campaigns, or the tightening encirclement of Berlin. It was the news of a total, unconditional, and catastrophic collapse of the Third Reich. Suddenly, the front pages of the newspapers left on the mess hall tables were dominated by stark, grainy, black and white photographs taken by combat photographers accompanying the advancing Allied armies. They were documenting the liberation of places with names that had previously only been whispered as rumors: Buchenwald, Dachau, and Ohrdruf. The images printed in the morning editions depicted horrors that defied human comprehension: mass graves, emaciated survivors, and the undeniable industrialized infrastructure of mass extermination. For the German prisoners, the cognitive dissonance was absolute and devastating. Only hours earlier, they had been sitting in heated barracks, sipping cold Coca-Cola, and calculating their weekly scrip wages from planting crops in the American Midwest. Now they were forced to reconcile their well-fed, comfortable captivity with the sudden, glaring revelation that the government they had sworn a blood oath to defend was morally bankrupt on a scale unprecedented in human history. The initial wave of reaction sweeping through the compounds was a desperate, deeply entrenched psychological defense mechanism: complete denial. Many prisoners instinctively rejected the newspaper reports as crude, fabricated American propaganda, insisting the photographs were either staged or depicted the victims of Allied bombing campaigns. They clung desperately to the myth of an honorable, clean war fought by regular soldiers, refusing to accept that their state was capable of systematic genocide. But the American administration's posture abruptly shifted. The era of passive, gentle re-education, of relying on library books, jazz records, and subtle intellectual diversion, ended overnight. The War Department, alongside a deeply shocked and infuriated American public, lost all patience for the comfortable illusion of the honorable adversary. The prevailing attitude in Washington hardened instantly. The men eating American food and sleeping in American beds had actively fought to preserve the very regime responsible for the atrocities now laid bare. The Provost Marshal General's office realized that allowing the prisoners to hide behind willful skepticism was no longer an option. A massive, unavoidable psychological reckoning was required. Reading newsprint and debating politics in the canteen was too detached, too easily dismissed by defensive men as Allied forgery. If these hundreds of thousands of soldiers were ever going to be repatriated to a ruined Germany and tasked with rebuilding a functioning society, they could not be allowed to take the myth of their own innocence with them. The American military command made a decisive, unprecedented ruling. Passive reading was entirely insufficient. The prisoners were going to be forced to witness the absolute, horrifying destruction of their ideology firsthand, in a way they could never unsee or deny. May 1945, Germany was officially defeated. The Third Reich was extinct. Inside the massive network of internment camps across the United States, a terrifying, irreversible psychological confrontation was methodically orchestrated. The gentle re-education, the jazz records, and the subtle library books were abruptly set aside. The Allied Supreme Command demanded an inescapable reckoning, a visual weapon that could not be rationalized away, logic that could not be debated. The American administration initiated a policy of compulsory, aggressive, and universal exposure. They called it Confrontation by film. It was no longer a movie night. It was a mandatory, supervised, tactical operation aimed directly at the human psyche. The primary visual mechanism of this operation was a documentary short film entitled Die Todesmühlen, The Death Mills. This 22-minute feature, created by the U.S. Army's Information and Education Division specifically for a defeated German populace, was not based on hearsay, Allied statistics, or stylized propaganda. It was composed entirely of unedited, raw combat footage and liberation documentation from Bergen-Belsen, Buchenwald, Dachau, and Ohrdruf, captured by American and British cameramen only weeks earlier. In camp after camp, from the sweltering heat of Texas to the cooler plains of Kansas, Thousands of Wehrmacht soldiers, sailors, and airmen were marched under exceptionally heavy guard, armed with machine guns and accompanied by military police dogs, into the wooden camp theaters. There was zero choice to attend. The guards took their positions, lining the walls and doorways, and the lights were extinguished, plunging the massive halls into near total darkness. For the next 22 minutes, the only illumination in the room was the harsh, flickering light emanating from the movie screen. The footage projected in the darkness was cataclysmic. It did not just depict death. It depicted the systematic, industrialized assembly lines of murder. The prisoners, who for years had eaten primally and slept soundly under the shield of Geneva Convention protections, were now forced to look upon the absolute void of their regime's morality. The visual shock of the mass graves, the emaciated survivors, the gas chambers, and the stacks of personal belongings was mathematically undeniable. It was not a debate about strategic bombing. It was a demonstration of a total collapse of human civilization orchestrated by the government they had sacrificed everything to defend. The physical atmosphere inside the screening rooms was suffocating. The air was heavy, hot, and instantly charged with a volatile mixture of profound disbelief, overwhelming shame, and rising fury. It was a mass, inescapable cognitive trauma. The unedited footage violently collided with their deeply ingrained sense of military honor, creating a psychological trauma that no amount of canteen soda could ever pacify. In the darkness, surrounded by guards, the remaining ideological structures of the Fourth Reich simply evaporated, leaving behind a profound and dangerous vacuum. This mandated viewing triggered a chaotic spectrum of behavioral breakdowns in the darkness. Hundreds of prisoners, unable to process the empirical evidence, simply broke down, weeping uncontrollably into their hands. In other camps, a heavy, paralyzing silence descended, a massive collective dissociation from the horrifying images on the screen. And in the most radical camps, a primal, dangerous fury erupted. Fanatical officers stood up in the dark, screaming at the screen that the entire film was a Hollywood hoax, only to be met with a volatile chorus of roars from their own men who were finally seeing the horrifying logic of their entire lost war and were ready to tear the enforcers limb from limb. The American administration, maintaining a cool logistical detachment throughout the entire operational sequence, was not aiming for forgiveness or reconciliation. The objective was the surgical extraction of ideological certainty. They was utilizing raw fact as the ultimate weapon of defeat, methodically ensuring that no soldier who viewed that footage could ever repatriate to a future ruined Germany and still honestly claim they fought for a righteous cause. When the visual shock finally ended, the harsh house lights of the theater were instantly snapped back on. The sudden illumination revealed thousands of shell-shocked, pale faces staring silently downward at the dusty floorboards. In that one defining historical moment, as the mandatory film finished and the projection stopped, the pride of the conquering army had been entirely erased. They were no longer the disciplined, formidable soldiers of the Third Reich. They had been transformed, in 22 minutes, into the broken, defeated, and ashamed citizens of a permanently ruined nation. When the transport ships finally carried these men back across the Atlantic in the months following the unconditional surrender, the stark reality of their defeat was no longer just a flicker on a camp movie screen. It was the physical, unavoidable landscape of their homecoming. The same battle-hardened veteran who had stepped off a train into the sweltering American Midwest in 1943, bracing for torture but receiving a glass bottle of Coca-Cola, now stepped off a train into the apocalyptic ruins of his own country. The contrast was almost incomprehensible. He returned healthy, well-fed, and fundamentally transformed, carrying a canvas duffel bag packed with the quiet remnants of his internment, a high-quality American shaving kit, a meticulously kept notebook from a camp correspondence course, and a completely shattered worldview. He walked out of the rail yard into a pulverized wasteland of skeletal buildings, starving civilians, and a society reduced to absolute zero. Standing in the cold ashes of the empire he had once sworn a blood oath to expand, the true, devastating weight of the American internment strategy finally settled in. The War Department's rigid, uncompromising adherence to the Geneva Convention had never merely been an act of diplomatic legalism or soft-hearted humanitarianism. It was a cold, calculated, and overwhelming demonstration of democratic industrial supremacy. The United States had weaponized its own domestic abundance. By feeding captured enemies prime rations, paying them standardized wages to harvest civilian crops, and allowing them to casually purchase luxury consumer goods while simultaneously fighting a massive two-front global war, the American military had executed a logistical masterclass in psychological warfare. They had systematically dismantled the fanatical foundations of the Third Reich, not through aggressive interrogations or physical coercion, but through the crushing, undeniable weight of a vastly superior reality. The totalitarian propaganda machine had demanded unquestioning loyalty and promised a 1,000-year utopia, yet it ultimately delivered only mass graves and total national annihilation. The American system made no such grandiose ideological promises. It simply delivered endless supply trains, functioning labor markets, and fully stocked canteen shelves. For the returning prisoner, the final conclusion was absolute. The fierce fanaticism he had once bled for had been completely and permanently neutralized by the mundane, unyielding reality of a 10-cent paper coupon and the quiet, unstoppable machinery of a free world. In the end, the United States did not defeat the remnants of Nazi ideology behind barbed wire with torture, starvation, or forced political manifestos. They defeated it by letting their enemies buy a cold bottle of soda, earn a daily wage, and ultimately sit in a darkened room to watch the undeniable, horrifying truth of their own total ruin unfold on a movie screen.